Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the CIC webinar on site safety gathering. Today, our topic is enhancing site safety by behavioral change. Before we go to the rundown, I would like to thank you, Mr. Restaurant, the chairperson of the subcommittee of safety promotion and also the chairman of Health and Safety Committee of Hong Kong CA to join us today to be our speaker and also the moderator as well today to facilitate the webinar. The rundown today, we will have 2 hours time, and also we have lucky enough to invite some overseas speaker to join us. And after the overseas speaker presentation, we will have a panel discussion and also a Q&A session. For the overseas speaker, may I introduce Mr. Paul Behavioural. He's a solicitor of a company in the UK. He's widely regarded for swift incident response and crisis management following fatalities. He also has particular interest in health as well as safety, and also lead teams on safety review project in the energy and aerospace sector. And the other speaker, Ms. Alisa Alisa Powell-Hopewell. She is the managing director of a therapy and training academy. She is experienced in sector influencing and improving behavioral, situational awareness, culture development, and also behavioral safety and discipline. And the last speaker is Professor Tim Marsh. He is the professor of Plymouth University and the founder of Marsh Safety. Tim was one of the team leader of the original UK research into behavioral safety in construction in the early 1990s. He has also written dozens of magazine article, academic article, and also the books Effective Safety Management, Talking Safety, Total Safety Culture, Safety Savant, and Definite Guide to Behavioral Safety, and also a Handbook of Organized Well-Being. So without ado, I would like to pass the time to Wes, our moderator today, and try to have a welcoming address and also his PowerPoint presentation. So I leave the time to Wes.
Thank you, Tony. And once again, welcome to our 3 experts from the UK, as they were introduced by Tony, Paul, Alexis, and Tim. And also a warm welcome to our over 2,000 members of the audience, who have joined us this afternoon in Hong Kong time. And some of us, I know, join us from the overseas. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. So this part, it's like any great movie in the cinema. There's the preview, So this next 10 minutes, I'm going to share some message on behalf of the organizer. And as we all know, today's theme is about how to enhance site safety by behavioral change. And in Hong Kong, construction industry, of course, all the stakeholders are very concerned about how to further enhance site safety. And this event is actually with the strong support from Hong Kong government's Development Bureau, and it's co-organized by the Construction Industry Council as well as the Hong Kong Construction Association. So the following is some material to share with the 2 co-organizing organizations in Hong Kong. But at the same time, because after the presentation from our 3 guest speakers, we will have a panel discussion. So I hope the following material can also help our overseas guests as well as audience to have a glimpse of some of the activities in Hong Kong in the coming months, and how we look at how to some of these efforts to further enhance construction safety. It will be great to hear the feedback in the panel discussion as well as in the Q&A session from our general audience. So in the part of the CIC, the Construction Industry Council is a statutory body in Hong Kong. It's a platform with all the relevant industry stakeholders in Hong Kong. So in the next few months, you can see there are different events and activities. I'll just quickly walk through them one by one. And they are targeted at recognition. You can see some award and ceremony and presentations. They're also knowledge sharing, so such as the event today, we have conferences and talk. But there's also events and activities that emphasize on site activities as well. So I'll quickly share with all of us here. One of the example is that how in Hong Kong the general construction site safety has improved a lot over the years, but at the same time the fatalities in construction accidents remain at a similar level, throughout the past decade. So the four major areas that we are facing these risks is from, as you can see in the slide, working at height, lifting, heavy machinery use, as well as electricity related risk. So this one event is about how to engage the top management of clients as well as contractors organization to get onto the site and work together with the site teams to communicate and to share the best practices among industry players. Similarly, other events organized by CIC upcoming in July 2nd would be it's sort of like TED, TED Talks. So ideas worth sharing, but in the context of construction industry. And this upcoming event will be sharing from one of our local speakers about construction site safety as well. And the very important event in Hong Kong construction industry every year is the Construction Safety Week, organized by the Development Bureau as well as CIC. And this year's theme is about how to use technology to enhance site safety. So you can see the theme is safety and smart site. And you can see in this event the various components of the event, including some positive reinforcement, so recognition programs, as well as this is one example of technology used for training for workers. So it's been some time already we introduced using technology such as virtual reality for construction site workers to training. But at the same time, recently CIC has launched a online platform where it's an open source, so everybody can go there and download different training material specific to the several high-risk areas that I pointed out earlier. And also industry, other related stakeholders, they can also upload their products. So it's really a industry-wide platform for everyone to share. So that is something that's upcoming from the CIC side. And moving on to the Hong Kong Construction Association, which is a 100-year-old trade organization representing the general contractors in Hong Kong, all the major companies. And in particular, one of the initiatives that I hope to take a few minutes to share is something called the Construction Safety Fund. And this initiative is really meant to promote, again, what we can do to enhance site safety using technology. And it's put this $10 million as a seed fund for applicants from around the world. So even today, our speakers from the UK or audience from around the world, you're all welcome to apply for up to $250,000. And mainly is to use innovation, how to further enhance site safety. As you can see, a lot of the model, the ecosystem is about matching construction companies with technology startups and then having these innovations, being deployed to site at a larger scale. And this, of course, also have the CIC support with the funding from the pre-approval list in the CITF fund, which is a $1 billion Hong Kong subsidy from the government managed by the CIC on supporting meaningful initiatives to apply technology in Hong Kong construction sites. Some of the examples of these funded projects are, there are altogether 14 of them now, around 5 million Hong Kong dollars. And the types of technology, as you can see, are wide-ranging, from the use of IoT technologies, AI, as well as the other types of technology. Again, some of these technologies, I think, coming back to today's theme, has to do with how to have better supervision, on the site activities of people, of machines, as well as the different ways of control systems, using technology such as these IoT devices and monitoring devices, as well as, again, more monitoring types of solution using machine learning and AI to provide alert for the site management personnel as well as the head office teams. So these are all projects such as this plan operator and driver status monitoring technology has already been deployed at the Hong Kong airport for a lot of their projects. There's a building of a new runway system there. So you can see this industry in Hong Kong, from the client to the industry to the different stakeholders are working together, using different ways to promote construction safety. Again, mention some other training, how to, I think today's theme about workers' behavior. So a lot of these technologies about how to, in addition to the ongoing trainings, classroom training, toolbox talks, traditional ways, how we can provide additional ways using technology to provide these training in more dynamic, more interactive ways. So finally, you will see that from the CIC Life First, which highlights the 4 high-risk area that I introduced in the beginning, the working at height, lifting, heavy machinery, and electricity high-risk activity, and how, for example, HKC being one of the industry stakeholders to echo, CIC's promotion of these Life First themes, are one of the many, many examples in Hong Kong, of using technology innovation and new ways, of facing up to the challenge. So I think this set the scene, really for today's discussion, because the thing I presented are things we already either have been doing or planning to do more. But of course, we are looking for all the possible ways, to really bring Hong Kong's construction safety to the next level. And it's really a wonderful opportunity, giving the 3 speakers, the experts, and what they experience from around the world. And also, I think they also have experience in Hong Kong and what they can offer to us. So without saying much further, I will introduce our very first speaker. That will be Paul, Mr. Paul Behavioural. I will pass the time to you. Paul, over to you. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak today. It's an honour and a privilege to address such a diverse and interesting audience as that which we now meet. John Shedd said, "A ship is safe in harbour, but that is not what ships are built for." And it's true, of course, when we think about safety, that the safest way to avoid risk is simply not to go to work. But Hong Kong Construction Association members have a spirit of bravery, intelligence, and entrepreneurship. We have to take risks to accomplish what we set out to do. But as we shall see, those risks are not hopeless risks. They're calculated with safety in mind. And as we go through my presentation this morning, I'd like you to think about the aspects of what makes things safe. I would like you to consider some of the lessons when we talk about fearless organisations. Is zero harm really the answer? And I'm going to introduce you this morning to the Behavioural model of safety leadership. So without further ado, we will begin by looking at the subject of bringing first aid to the uninjured, the Behavioural model. It's always difficult talking to a conference of some 2,000 people and trying to get their feedback. But what I'd like you to do is to go onto the web page, Slido. So if you go on Google and type the word Slido in, you will be presented with a box that you need to add in the number 321083. And in that box, there is a free text area for you to write your answer to my question. What is safety? And that might seem a strange question, or it may seem like the right question to ask at the beginning of a presentation on behavioural safety, because safety means different things to different people. So I'm going to invite you over the next minute and a half to go onto Slido and to write from your perspective, what safety means to you. I've got some definitions from previous people I've asked that question to. I've got a review of the literature, which tells us what esteemed academics believe safety is. What I'm interested in is what you think safety means to you. So as you enter Slido and type that number in, you should be able to see the free text box, what is safety. I'm expecting there'll be a flurry of answers to this. And I'm going to read those back. Thank you. People are already commenting excellently. And I'm going to keep an eye on those and feed some of those back to you. So I'm going to give you 60 seconds to answer the question. Thirty seconds left. So let me share with you some of the results that we've got. Planning the work, how to work safely without any risk. Controlling the risk to humans. Keeping people away from harm or danger. Minimizing all risk. Not getting hurt during work. Achieving zero injury. Absence of accidents. All good answers. But I want you to encourage you to think about safety in a different way. Let me give you an example. If I were to cross the main road entering the tunnels from Hong Kong Island to the New Territories at 8 a.m. on a Monday morning, it is possible that I would cross without being struck by a car. I wouldn't have had an accident. Nothing's happened to me. But I think we'd all agree that that would be an unsafe choice, because the action of taking my life into my own hands would be unsafe. Todd Conklin, the American thinker, suggests that safety is the ability of workers to be able to do things in a varying and unpredictable world. Sidney Dekker says safety is not the absence of errors and violations, but the presence of system resilience. And I would say that safety is a system of interactions involving leadership, culture, processes, training, supervision and design, which allows people to be uninjured when carrying out functions for you. The thing about safety is you can't bank it. You can't do a bit of extra safety on a Monday and then be safer on a Tuesday. It's not like it's a battery that we can charge. And as we go through our presentation today, what I like to think about are how do we build resilience in our people so that they ensure that they are not taking excessive risks, but that we all acknowledge that we have to take some risks in order to carry out our tasks. And I know that Dr. Marsh is going to address us on zero harm a little later. But one of the questions for all of us must be, is zero harm actually the answer? Or by the very nature of the fact that we engage in activities on construction sites, do we have to accept that there is an element of risk that will never be something that can be reduced to zero? You may recall seeing that image when Captain Sully Sullenberger was able to land his aircraft on the Hudson River when he had issues while flying. And what Sullenberger said was, as you can see in the heading, we can have the same training and same equipment as everyone else, but if our workforce takes ownership of the goal and derives something personal and meaningful, we will be better and more efficient and perform at a higher level, more consistently and more safely. And that's what behavioural safety is to me. All organisations do not set out to harm people when they go to work. Human beings, when they go to work, do not go out to hurt themselves. So there needs to be ownership of their own safety responsibilities in order to stay safe. And what I'd like to share with you now is a model which my colleague Sarah Valentine and I have pulled together, which looks at the Hillary step. The Hillary step is the last obstacle on Everest which climbers have got to surmount. And there's some lessons from that I'd like to share with you.
Many people know that in 1953, Sir Edmund Hillary, accompanied by Tenzing Norway, became the first person to summit Mount Everest. Here's what he said about the final ascent. After an hour's steady going, we reached the foot of the most formidable-looking problem on the ridge. A rock step some 40 feet high. We realised that at this altitude it might well spell the difference between success and failure. The rock itself, smooth and almost holdless, might have been an interesting Sunday afternoon problem for a group of expert rock climbers in the Lake District. But here it was a barrier beyond our feeble strength to overcome. What made exactly the same obstacle that might be climbed with friends for fun at the weekend so dangerous to this most experienced adventurer? The top of Everest sits 28,839 feet above sea level. The step is the last challenge climbers face before reaching the summit. Those climbing will typically have spent weeks at base camps going up and down the mountain to acclimatise. As a result, by the time the climbers reach the obstacle, they will be exhausted. Setting off in the early hours of the morning of the final day to make a summit attempt, climbers will not have slept properly for many days. Those who try to get up the Hillary step then face the danger of falling 10,000 feet on their right and 8,000 feet on their left. It's the highest mountain on Earth. The death zone begins at 26,247 feet. Here there is not enough oxygen for humans to live for very long. Stress is high. Many climbers have died on Everest because they failed to keep to agreed turnaround times. When a risk assessment of the hazards of darkness and plummeting temperatures are ignored due to a misplaced desire to complete the task at hand at all costs. Finally, in many expeditions, a lack of clear communication has resulted in warnings of impending storm fronts from those in the party being ignored by those leading the expedition, often due to arrogance from the leader or a failure to speak up from the climber. The Verrico-Valentine-Hillary step theory applies these factors to businesses. We seek to encourage businesses to consider sleep and fatigue as important factors in completing familiar tasks safely and properly. The research on sleep deprivation is clear. Regular sleep debt will significantly reduce performance. We need to plan for rest in the workforce. Workers react badly to psychologically unsafe workplaces. If every interaction with managers or colleagues feels like it could trigger criticism or penalty, the worker will inevitably perform poorly. We need to de-escalate fear to enable safety. Stress needs to be managed. Workers need to believe that speaking up will not lead to humiliation or punishment. Risk assessments are often created for work as imagined rather than work as done. Where safety rules are clear, they must be adhered to, even if that results in taking extra time or meaning you need to come back another day to the task with better resources or in better conditions. Those involved in a process are best placed to see dangers on the horizon. As leaders, we need to empower our people to speak up and warn of looming problems, rather than to be silenced because of a command structure. We need to be humble to take on board feedback and evaluate it critically against the situation. It can be life-saving. Sir Edmund ultimately conquered what became later known as the Hillary Step, with determination, a climbing rope and a lot of effort. Focusing on the 4 areas of our rope will do the same: rest, observation, planning, empowerment.
So the Verico-Valentine-Hillary step model looks at those 4 areas as being key to improve people's behaviour. In 1996, a party of climbers attempting to ascend and descend Everest were involved in a significant climbing fatality event. A number of people from the Adventure Consultants expedition did not make it home. And the subject matter of that climb forms the basis of the movie Everest, which you may have seen. One of the climbers was a journalist, a man called John Krakauer, who wrote a book called Into Thin Air. And what was really interesting was that when he talked about the perceptions of people in his party, he said this: people's perception of their own abilities are amazingly far off the mark. One teammate, for example, driven to an infantile state by his infirmities and could barely make it down to the South Col without being carried down, was that afterwards he was fine. He didn't need any help. We've all changed dramatically. Consciously or unconsciously, we've revised or embellished the details in ways that are incredibly preposterous when looked at in the cold light of day. And my background, my experience, is helping individuals and organisations, typically following industrial fatalities, either through a court process or through a culture transformation. And those comments are ones which we see in organisations where things have gone wrong, that they believe they are better than they are. Those of you who have read around safety books will know that the Deepwater Horizon in the United States of America celebrated 7 years without a lost time incident the day before the incident. We can be blinkered and think that we're doing things well, but that may not be true. Rest, and there's a paper which supports the cartoon that you've read, which will be available after the session. But rest is proven to be something that's just a matter of science. How we perceive that we are reacting may be very different to our actual reaction times when tested. Sarah and I have a theory that evidence assured is the key to organisations doing well. How do we know that the processes which we set out in our method statements, our risk assessments, our job safety analysis are actually being carried out by not only us, but by the contractors who work with us? How do we know that their safe systems of work are being carried out? So observation is critical to safe behaviours. And Dr. Marsh has his own model of coaching conversations in terms of how we can get the best from those observations. When it comes to planning, you'll have seen in the cartoon that a number of people didn't make it off Everest because they failed to keep turnaround times. And that was something which Krakauer talks about in relation to the 96 expedition, that there was a hard stop at 2 o'clock, wherever you were on the mountain. Even if you were 50 feet from the peak, you would turn around and go down. As it happened, on the 11th of May 1996, a number of people were allowed to get to the summit at 4 p.m. and disaster followed. How do we do with our planning? Do we make sure that we've got very clear instructions and that we follow those instructions? And if something comes up, that people have got the skill sets to be able to continue to behave safely. And when it comes to empowerment, a book which, again, is one that all three of the speakers today will refer to, is Amy Edmondson's Fearless Organization. And in her book, she sets out the following as being important as leadership tasks: the need to display humility in the appropriate places, acknowledging gaps that we may have as supervisors and managers. Some people don't feel belittled or unable to comment and help us see the problems which they face. Do we have forums for input from people who may be actually doing the building and construction? When we get feedback, even if it might not be what we want, are we grateful and acknowledge and thank people? And when things go wrong and people explain that they've gone wrong, do we look forward? Do we offer help? And is it only the clear violations that actually receive sanctions? Or do people feel that they are unable to engage and converse with us for fear that they may say the wrong thing and find themselves out of a job? And you'll see there that the accomplishments that this creates are shared expectations, confidence that voice is welcome, and orientation toward continuous learning. So at the conclusion of my talk, may I suggest that we consider the rope, the rest, observation, planning, and particularly we think about empowering people, because that's the way to improve behavioural safety. I close with the words of William Shakespeare. I thought that given I was sat in Middle England, it was appropriate to finish there. Who in Henry IV, Part 1 said this: "From this nettle, danger, we pluck this flower, safety." You and I work in environments that are often with risk. But by equipping people with the tools to behave safely, by putting system resilience in place, we will be in a position where we will be safe, they will be safe, and we will continue to learn together in a safe manner. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul, for that sharing. Okay, next up, we have Alexis. Over to you for our second guest presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to come and speak today. Okay, so my talk is going to be around organisational systems, which links in really well with both speakers' presentations today. Just to give me a bit of context, really, I'm not a safety practitioner. I am somebody who works with people. So my background is working in organisations, supporting cultural change, behavioural changes. I'm also a psychotherapist and systemic practitioner, which feeds into all of the work that I do at Fortis. And we provide a range of different services, but basically they're all around supporting people. So those conversations that you might be having with workers, with leaders, with managers, and trying to shift the culture forward into a direction that is safe and productive, that's something that that we do work around in collaboration with organisations. So today, I want to think about systemic thinking in organisations in quite a simple form, and then think about the effect of change on the workforce. And this is born out of, obviously, experience of working with people and seeing the barriers and the different approaches that can support workforces in being able to move forward. The importance of leadership, which is really important when you're looking at managing change and cultural development, and also your workforce engagement. And finishing with fixing the work or fixing the system and considering whether punishment is the right answer. So in your organisation, people are your biggest resource. They are your treasure chest. They are the people who are, the productive element of your organisation. But how are you tapping into that resource? How are you tapping into those people, and how are you managing them in a positive way to be able to get from them everything that you possibly can as a business? So, we know that they are very important in terms of making sure that your health and safety is on point, that your production is good, that your cost of quality, all of those aspects that we look at from a business perspective. But how much of the resource of the people in your organisation is not being tapped into? So this is the way that my brain works. So I just wanted to kind of talk a bit about this. So when we're thinking about a system, we're thinking about the whole aspect of the system. So this is a car engine. And when we are thinking about what happens within a system, if we think about it in this way, where we have different components and different aspects that need to work together in order for the organisation to work well, then we can start to think about what might happen if the organisation isn't working that well. And when I say organisation, I mean the people within the organisation. So if we consider a rusty car engine, you'll have parts of that engine that aren't working correctly, that constantly make a noise, that always lets down the rest of the engine. That might be a recurring problem that might be fixed for a while and then may come back again. There might be a pattern associated with that behaviour. There might also be parts of that engine that are working quite well, but can't be seen to be working well because the rest of the system isn't working brilliantly. And when we have a car, we make sure that we have it serviced regularly, that we are doing oil changes, that we're making sure there's plenty of water in the radiator. There's all these different aspects that we do when we're managing our cars. And it's exactly the same when we're thinking about an organisation. There are squeaky cogs that need to get oiled. There are gaps that are in the system that maybe we aren't aware of, that we maybe need to be conscious of. The engine might be getting a bit run down. There might be a lot of noise in certain aspects. But all of this is connected to each other. So if you've got parts of an organisation that isn't working that well, then the chances are there's a knock-on ripple effect that goes beyond that point and affects other parts of the organisation. It just stands to reason that's the way that it would work. And from my experience of working in organisations, often we can see that there's certain aspects of teams and managerial hierarchies that are blamed for aspects of the system not working well, or might be workers that are blamed. But actually, if we kind of look through that and look and investigate, we can see that actually there's far more going on in other aspects that might be contributing to that presentation. So it's what we need to do in order to be able to help that engine run as smoothly as possible. And when we are thinking about it in terms of a car, we would expect that we would regularly check that engine and make sure that it's running smoothly so that we can have that running, cost effectively for many years. However, when we're looking at our organisations and our businesses, sometimes we don't put in regular checks and regular conversations and systems and processes in place to be able to understand what is actually going on in our business. So some of the behaviours that I would see when a system is having difficulties can range from all sorts of different aspects. So some of these can be quite quiet behaviours and might be quite avoidant, not wanting to step forward, as Paul was talking about, not wanting to say anything in case there might be some repercussions to that. There might be some resistance to management and to leadership. And often that can be pockets of resistance, not necessarily blanket resistance, but pockets of resistance that can become quite difficult to manage if they're left without any thought or any reflection or any ideas about how to move forward. You might have a lack of engagement from the workforce, and you might have a reduction in discretionary effort. So discretionary effort is where, if someone is invested in what they're doing and they care about what they're doing and they feel valued, they're going to go over and above what you're actually employing them to do. And they will put in extra effort. And that's discretionary. So actually, if you've got a workforce that feel engaged and happy and valued, then you're going to get far more of that effort than you do if people are just literally working to what they've been told to do and within the hours and the timeframes they've been given. You might see an increase in health and safety incidences and a reduction in recording. And, that's something that I've seen where there's a reduction in recording for fear of what might happen if they do record what's going on, even near miss incidences. There's a decrease in productivity, or productivity is reaches a level and you can't seem to get past that point. When actually, if people were feeling engaged in what they were doing, then you'd be able to move past that point. It's just a barrier and a boundary. In my experience, I see an increase in aspects like disciplinaries, where members of staff are being held to account, but almost too many disciplinaries for what is actually going on, and maybe in a reaction to behaviours that is over and above where it needs to be, because leadership and management are frustrated with what's happening in the workforce. Might also see absenteeism. So as Paul was saying there about stress within the workplace, people start to not be able to cope with coming to work and will withdraw. I see difficulties in team dynamics. So especially over the past year as well, with everything that's been happening, people have all responded in their own ways. And so we see relationship breakdowns where we might see splits within teams, or there might be difficulties within leadership and a member of their workforce. So that's where mediation would come in terms of trying to support those relationships to move forward. And also stuckness. And stuckness is a psychotherapy term, but I see this in organisations. So when I'm thinking about their culture and I'm working with a leadership team, we're looking at what's the historic narrative. So what are the stories that go on in this organisation, and where do we get stuck with those? And are those things we want to move forward? Are those stories things that would be beneficial to move forward and to change the narrative? And if we're going to change the narrative, so, what the stories about your business and your organisation, then what are we changing them to? What would be ideal? We know that change is just part of life. And, if we haven't learned that over the past year, then, there's something missing. We know that change is a part of our lives, and it's always been a part of our lives. And we also know that some people often struggle with it, but there's nothing more certain than change. So we know that change is coming. We know that we restructure organisations. We know that we look and review what we're doing, and we plan for the market and what we're trying to achieve. And there's a lot of different theories around managing change. But when people generally struggle with change, they have a range of emotions, and that range of emotions can sometimes be quite messy. And it's worse when change isn't paced well, and when it's not communicated clearly. So when you're looking to make changes, how well do you communicate what they are? How collaboratively do you do that? How many conversations do you have with people within the organisation to understand the impact of what that change will be and what their worries are about it? Because as leaders and managers, you may have thought about those things and you may have answers for them, but actually, unless the workforce understand the reasons behind the decision-making processes and the actions that you're doing, or can at least influence, then you're going to have that resistance and all those behaviours I spoke about a second ago. The way that I see this is that we are nudging the system. So, you might create, have an understanding of what you're going to do. So that might include having, engagement sessions with staff and workforce, and being able to create plans and gap analysis, and being able to really kind of get to grips with what's the line in the sand right now. Where are we operating from right now? And then you do your action plan and you put into place what it is you want to do in order to influence the system and influence the people. And then you review it and then you nudge it along in a different way. So you might have a different group of people that you work with within the organisation, or you might bring in other leaders and other managers. The approach really needs to be proactive and responsive to the needs of the people in the business. And often when my business come into support when there's been an accident in the workplace, and we do debriefs and support people with traumatic responses, that's more of a reactive position to be in. And we want really to be able to, manage that well before we get to that point. So often there are human factors and behaviours that were evident but not necessarily acknowledged. So understanding your culture within your organisation and being able to forward plan it and nudge it along a system is going to be really helpful. When we think about engagement and involvement, there are several different aspects to consider here. There are barriers that we see within workforces. And some of that can be due to conversations that happen amongst the workforce. So it might not be anything that really leadership and management are aware of. It might be around fear and trust, fear of stepping forward, fear of speaking, fear of making a mistake, lack of trust. Might feel that they're not respected. Those aspects are going to immediately mean that somebody potentially will step back. So we go into a kind of fight or flight response. And you might have some people who will fight and will step forward, but some who will step back. And so that can be a real barrier. The building trust and building respect and value is always going to have a better response from the workforce than trying to manage by fear. Language can be a barrier. So when I talk about language, I'm talking about language within the business, within the sector, within the organisation. Does everybody understand what all that different, the terminology means, the abbreviations, all of those things can be a barrier within the organisation as well. And not walking the walk from a leadership perspective. So the way that I think about this is about modelling the model. So, if there's a certain way that you want people to behave in your business, then it's important that you behave in that way too. It's difficult to have a perspective of do as I say, not as I do. You're automatically there giving out conflicting messages. Whereas if you're walking the walk and you're modelling the model, then you are bestowing the virtues of what it is you want to see from the people that you're employing. If you have a transient and migrant workforce, obviously that can create barriers as well because it's constantly changing, and that can mean that workers don't stay for long, or that they're moving on, or again this comes back to the language aspect as well, that there might be different languages and how are people understanding each other. So the movement within a workforce can actually be a barrier as well. Shift working, so trying to engage people who are working shifts, and when they're, especially if you're working 24 hours a day, which you may do. If you're working 24 hours a day and you've got shifts that are working and rolling, how do you engage all those people equally? How do they access communication? If we move along to the next box there about technology, some of the businesses that I work in, there isn't any access to technology for lots of the workers. They're doing the job. If they haven't got access to technology, how are you communicating with them? How are they getting the messages from you? What creative ways can you manage that in order to make sure that they are being thought about within the communication strategy within the business? How are leaders and managers making sure those messages are consistent? Another aspect that I see is about not acting. So, if you are given feedback, or if there's an issue, how do you act around that? And do you act on it? And if you don't act on it because there's a good reason not to, how do you communicate that? So again, it's open to interpretation, perceptions, but people will see what they see, and what they see is what they then translate into the behaviours, so that their understanding will be what they see as opposed to actually what's going on behind the scenes. So if you've got managers and leaders who are also under pressure and stress, there can be a sense of workforce not wanting to speak to managers and leaders because they're already busy. and are already stressed. So, I'll keep that to myself. So, this is just a sample of some of the barriers, but there's so many different barriers to consider, and it's difficult to overcome all of them. And it's not possible to overcome everything, but it is possible to understand what the barriers are for your teams and for your workforces, and within your organisation, so that you can start to consider, how do we overcome some of these aspects? Another side to this is about reflective thinking and practice. So we have thinking systems, and all of these things are talks in their own right. So I'm just going to kind of quickly go over this, but we have our automatic thinking. So this is our unconscious way of thinking. We don't really put much effort into it. It's just there. It's our automatic responses, and it's quite rapid. So we have our automatic thinking, and we live in that quite a lot. And that's how we do our jobs. That's how we manage everything that we manage. However, we also have a reflective thinking system. And this is something that I've seen a big shift towards in terms of businesses. When do we actually get time to reflect and think about what we need to do and what's the best way forward? How do we decide what requires our effort and our attention, rather than just being that automatic way of thinking and just kind of reacting and responding? When do we take a step back and consider, what do we actually need to do? You might do that if there's been an incident. You might do a process of elimination, an investigation, a root cause analysis. You might, lessons learned, all of that. Actually, putting that reflective thinking into everyday business means that we are being far more considered about our decision-making processes than just going into automatic thinking all the time. It's a slower pace, it's a slower way of thinking, and it means that we can moderate our automatic thinking. So if we apply this idea to everybody who works for you or within your team, your organisation, everybody is responding and reacting in this way. How often do you actually create time for that reflective thinking and being able to then inform the automatic thinking system? So time to consider, time to reflect, time to plan, and then make better decisions as a result. We can't be in reflective thinking all the time, any more than we can be in automatic thinking all the time, but we do need to have a mix of the two. So thinking about overcoming some of these barriers, having an opportunity to actively listen to people. And that's something that when Fortis comes into organisations, we are actively listening to what people have to say. We haven't got any preconceived ideas. There's no judgment about, what they may or may not say. Just really interested to hear what they have to say and what their experiences are. Having a communication strategy, and it's not just a one way. It's not just coming from leadership down, it's coming both ways. So how do you manage your communication both ways? How do you hear what's happening from the workforce? Sharing ideas from the workforce who actually do the job. So I was doing some engagement sessions last week, and somebody said to me that the leadership had spent £80,000 on a piece of kit that actually doesn't do the job that it needs to do, and nobody had asked the people who actually use the equipment. And that's the kind of thing that we see quite often, and it's an awful lot of money for a piece of kit that's then put to one side. Building trust and being consistent in messages is really key. And doing surveys and listening to what people have to say. If you can't speak to them and and that's not possible, then how are you capturing what their perspective is? Who has ownership over anything that you then plan from that information, and over what time frame? And are you involving the workforce in everything that you do? When I say everything, I mean the things that directly impact on. Strategically, it's going to be decisions that you make, but listening and really listening to what they have to say can be massively helpful in building that value and building their trust. And I think, for me, leadership is key. It's the main aspect of being able to get the culture right, to improve production, to improve health and safety. And this is taken from the HSE, Health and Safety Executive in the UK. The key leadership values there, again, this is the whole training in its own right, but I just want to kind of gloss over it really. You can see there those key leadership values, And the fourth one there about promoting fairness and trust in relationships with others as a leader, I think is a really key one when we're talking about the subjects we're talking about today. And the foundations for that archway there in terms of those 5 leadership values is having involvement and communication. And again, 2-way communication. And then also having that effective role modeling. So modeling the model. If those 2 pillars aren't in place, then the rest of that isn't going to work. And that's the same as if you take out any sections of those in terms of, say, number 2 being considerate and responsive. If that isn't there, it's not going to work. So these are the values and the aspects that I see in organisations that if we're thinking about this and we're moving forward and have a plan around how to make sure that this is consistent, it's really important that we focus on it. So if we're looking at value 4, we're thinking about being able to visibly demonstrate fairness, having integrity, building those relationships that so that we can actually create trust within relationships. So there is the conversation that happens, walking the walk, talking the talk, and sharing that responsibility and delegation so that people can actually feel that they have that responsibility and ownership. Ownership is a key part of people feeling valued within an organisation. So if you just think about fixing the workforce or fixing the system, just before I finish, with what I see is that the default position within organisations is blame. So as I said earlier, little or no near miss reporting. There is no data to learn from anything. And I know that we're going to talk a little bit later about just culture. So I just wanted to kind of give a nod to it really, that actually what we want is less blame and more about accountability and that recognition. So we get that balance between the two. And once we work towards a balance between the two, then we're going to have far better responses and less near misses and less barriers in place. I see the blame culture really crippling organisations. The other aspect is to understand the why. So your people need to understand why they're doing what they're doing. You know, there's a whole Vroom's model of motivation around this, around if people need to understand why they're doing it. If they feel that they understand why, if you just tell them and they don't understand the importance of what they're doing, the chances are they won't do it as well as you want them to. And that'll be a consistent thing that keeps happening. So understanding the why and being able to be communicated with both ways and feeling valued within the organisation from leaders. So when this is done well, this is what I see in organisations. People are included in joint managers and decisions with safety representatives, reduction in the accidents. We see that the workforce is more valued, increased attendance, smashing productivity targets and quality and safety, and also managers being more visible. So managers are on site and talking to people and have that confidence to do that. And that there's lots of feedback mechanisms being used to be able to get that 2-way communication, but also to lead forward in terms of what you're going to do as a business. And other mechanisms as well that then build from that. So once you know what you're dealing with, then it's about putting coaching in, really good training in, and that continuous professional development. It's never done. It's never going to be complete. So, you know, constantly nudging it along that process. As Paul said earlier, lots of praise and celebrating around successes and improved mental health and well-being as well, which is obviously a knock-on effect of coming to work and enjoying being part of the workplace. That's my talk for now. Please do get in touch if anybody would like to. I'm going to pass you over now to Professor Tim Marsh, who's going to do a talk about why people do what they do.
Thank you, Alexis. I'll try and share my screen and get that working. Okay. Hopefully, if I could just check with Rex. Tony, am I looking set?
Yes, all good. Tim?
Excellent. Okay. Well, first things first, thank you ever so much for having me. Lovely to be talking to you. And if you're already an hour in, thank you ever so much for staying with us. And thank you very much, of course, to Paul for inviting me along in the first place. So my talk really, it's previous speakers just to prove that I've been listening, well, obviously I agree with almost everything that was said, but two things that I think link what has been said to what I'm about to say. The first one is, Paul said, there's work as said, and there's work that's in the paperwork, but then there's work as done. And that's incredibly key to the talk that I'll be giving. And Alexis, talked about compliance, and it's very worth stating. I think it was Aubrey Daniels who coined the term. Compliance itself is often discretionary. And Alexis talked very well on the whole issue of discretionary effort. But it's worth making the case that compliance itself is often discretionary. And when we talk about the key topic of this presentation, which is why do people not comply? Well, we've already talked about it in great depth. I was asked to talk about zero harm, also about just culture, the cheese model, and then workforce involvement. So I'll start with zero harm. And of course, hugely controversial, but an excellent principle. Nobody disagrees with the principle that we should strive for zero harm. With the benefit of hindsight, almost every accident and illness can be prevented if we have the benefit of hindsight. But actually, of course, trying to go for zero harm is incredibly controversial, because if you have a very risk-filled, busy industry, you will not have achieved zero harm by the end of January, typically. And so a lot of people get very upset about it. There are issues around reporting and motivation and so on. But the big controversy, and I think something more constructive, and again, I want to pick up on what Paul said about building and constructing a strong safety culture, is perhaps we could challenge the definition of zero harm. Some figures from the UK. In the UK, we used to kill a lot of people. We don't kill so many anymore. We've gone from around 4,500 over the century to around, I think it's 140, the last figures. But what we do have, and of course skewed hugely towards the construction industry. You're much more likely to be killed in construction than any other industry apart from agriculture. But what we become increasingly aware of in the UK, and especially in UK construction, a lot of the very best work in mental health has been driven in the UK construction industry, because of former rugby league players is the link. And we're aware of the fact that around 5,000 working age people will kill themselves. So we know that good work is good for you, bad work is bad for you. We know that directly feeds in to these figures. And so what happens is sometimes we just drive people to implode on a given day. But more often, what we find is a bad work experience that delivers sort of death by 1,000 cuts. And it's that chipping away at morale that just makes people so desperate they might actually take their own lives. But worse than that, the BOHS, the British Occupational Hygiene Society, stress that for every person we kill in an accident, something like 100 people will die a premature death because of exposure at work. And those figures aren't getting any better because of new pathogens that we're inventing. We're on top of things like asbestos now, usually, but there are new pathogens that we don't fully understand yet that are making the situation worse rather than better. So I think my big challenge, and a segue into some of the very best work being done in UK construction, is about exposure, is about mental health. This is Reason's cheese model that I've been asked to talk about. And the cheese model, I think, really puts a lot of this in context. What it says is, look, there are lots of things that go wrong for somebody to get hurt. Typically, we will have made a bad decision at a strategic level. We would have agreed to do something that we shouldn't have agreed to do. And I'll talk about that in more detail in a minute. Then we won't have very good systems. Maybe our maintenance is poor, our supervision is poor, our training is poor, our auditing process is tick box, etc. Then we'll have poor frontline supervision, perhaps, where people aren't empowered to challenge, where the communication is poor, dialogue is poor, and I'll talk about that in great detail. And then at the end, of course, an unsafe behavior. There could be something as simple as failing to hold the handrail, or it could be failing to wear PPE. And all of these risk factors line up and somebody gets badly hurt. So, you know, because obviously what we're trying to do is to design out the risk of PPE by designing a system that doesn't require PPE in the first place. And the model is really simple. It says the more holes there are, the larger they are, the more often they are open, the more often they are to line up. It's a really simple but powerful model. But it really starts with something I really want to address directly. We often find, particularly in construction industry and organization industries like that, that a lot of people look very much towards the back end of the model, the front line stuff, and it can be quite blamey. You know, they were trained, they had the tools. I think I told them how to be safe, and yet they weren't, and it can skew the blame towards the individual who is standing next to the final risk, and away from the strategic stuff at the beginning where we make our plans and so on. And I think it's incredibly important that we remember that as an industry, we will have the accidents this week that we as an industry are geared up to have. You know, it's not about people being foolish. It is because we have set people up to fail. And it's just a question of who actually is standing next to the last hole and who gets hurt. And we always have to start at the right-hand side of the diagram, not at the left-hand side of the diagram. Two main problems with a blame-focused culture, really. The first one, it reduces objectivity of analysis and hence the efficacy of response. You know, there are flukes, but in life, the more astutely and accurately you analyze what's happening and what's not happening, the more effectively you can spend your money in responding to it. And the second thing is it's demotivating. If you're in a blame culture, you tend to be demotivated and switched off. And that is the very last thing we want of our frontline workers, is to be demotivated and switched off. We want them switched on, please. And a cartoon to a direct quote from an oil rig in the 1990s that I worked. You know, we have no name, no blame on this platform. It's just that management love to know who it is they're not blaming. And when that's the sort of thing that you hear in a canteen, in a smoke shack, you know that you've probably got a poor quality dialogue system. You're not having good quality communications from the bottom up, because there's a perception that if you say the wrong thing to the wrong person, it will be career limiting. So I want to introduce you, if I can, to a jockey. I know we're now an hour and 10 minutes in, so enough of PowerPoints and some stories. I shared a stage with this man, and he's an Irish jockey, and he introduced himself as the losingest jockey in the history of horse racing. I know you like your horse racing in Hong Kong. He said, look, I have fallen off a horse more times than any jockey in the history of professional riding. More than that, I have got on a horse and lost more times than any jockey in the history of professional horse riding. 14,000 times I've got on a horse and not won. I've also broken every bone in my body, and most of them several times. You know, I am the losingest jockey in history. Now, I believe you have accumulators. I know you like to bet on your horses in Hong Kong. So I want you to imagine you've got a nice little 4-horse accumulator. You know, you've your 10-to-1s come in, your 3-to-1s come in, your 5-to-1s come in, and the 4th bet is an evens bet, and everything is now riding on this evens bet, and you find out that this jockey is the jockey on the horse. I imagine you'd be thinking, oh no, anybody but him. Anybody but him, please. And let's some photos of him in action. Here he is in an ambulance. Here he is falling off, falling off, falling off, down and out. And I want you to. I'm hoping that you were with me on this, and you were thinking that this guy is not the man you want riding the 4th horse in your 4-horse accumulator. But you should, because this is Tony McCoy. Tony McCoy is the most successful rider in the history of horse riding. He has actually ridden more than 4,200 winners, which is a world record. And again, when he gave his talk, the Irish jockey, he said, so I might be the losingest jockey in the history of horse riding, but I'm also the winningest jockey in the history of horse riding. And the point that he's making, of course, is if you strive, if you make an effort to excel, you will fail. People learn by trial and error. That's why we can do this by Zoom, across the world. We are a fabulously successful species, but we learn by trial and error. And to succeed and to excel, you will fail on the way. And Tony McCoy, of course, is a good example of that. If you get nothing else from this talk, please know that the core of it, culture is king, and culture is made up of three things: the quality of your systems, your procedures, your training, your inductions. Of course, you want to have hit diminishing returns with that. The second thing is the quality of your transformational leadership. So praising, not criticizing, because it's 20 times as effective. Coaching, not telling, because it's 10 times as effective. Remembering that you're always leading by example, whether you want to be or not. Quality of your dialogue. And the third of the three principles is an objective, analytical understanding of what's happening and why it's happening. So covered, if you get nothing else from this talk, this I think is the best book written about safety in the last 20 years. It's a generic book by Matthew Said, who used to play table tennis for the living, called Black Box Thinking. And it really covers this trial and error incredibly well. Carol Dweck's multi-million selling mindset covers exactly the same material. And we've already talked about the Fearless Organization, Amy Edmondson. It's about creating a place where being honest and open isn't perceived to be dangerous to you. And a just culture model, I haven't really got time to go into it in any great detail, but the just culture model covers this really well. It's taking a systemic, consistent, and objective approach to when things go wrong. And what you'll find is it's hardly ever the frontline workers' fault. And I'll come back to that in a second. Interestingly, in recent couple of years, a lot of our clients have really looked systemically at the levels of trust within the organization. Any well-being expert will say that the number one metric that you should be looking at is how much trust is there in your organization. This is our model. We start with mistrust, no name, no blame. Transactional trust: if I keep my nose clean, do as I'm told, I'll be in trouble. Trust in management: there is a just culture model. They're trying to have a values-based approach, but it doesn't always work. Trust in equity: the workforce will work with management on such as a just culture model. Trust in ownership is the management trust the workforce to run it themselves. So it's those levels of empowerment and ownership. And before you think we've lost the plot and got completely naive, it's worth quoting this book. This is one of Europe's leading spies who's just written this book. And he says, you should always trust. As a society, we thrive when we trust. The default must be to expect the best, because if we expect the worst, all sorts of self-fulfilling prophecies in a negative way, a lot of vicious circles rather than virtuous circles kick off. So what we want is to trust. It's far better to trust and be taken advantage of than it is to assume the worst as a species. But he's not an idiot, and he says, so trust everybody, because I want to set off positive self-fulfilling prophecies, and I want to set off virtuous circles, but verify everything. And I think that's as good a rule of thumb for life as I'm going to come up with. So this is the just culture model. And what it basically says is, look, when things have gone wrong, there were two reasons for this primarily. The first one was it was unintentional. It's a lack of training, a lack of equipment, a lack of time, tiredness, and so on. And a really good example to try and break this up and get you working is, if you have the space, stand up, stand on your left leg, and try and rotate your right leg clockwise. So you stand on your left leg and you do a clockwise rotation of your right leg. That should be incredibly error-free. Then, if you could point at the ceiling and draw a nice big fat figure of 6 in front of you like that, that also should be error-free. But if you try now to do a figure of 6 from the top down and a clockwise rotation of your right leg, you should find that that's next to impossible. I'm hoping some of you have got the time and the space to stand up and have a go at that. If you do, let me know who you've got on. Normally we'd be in a hall. There would be 2,000 of you perhaps all doing that and having some fun and standing up and having a stretch. You're just a sea of black boxes to me. So I'm hoping some of you are trying that because that's a physiologically difficult thing to do. What you need to do is and again, I think it was Alexis who said, talk to people. Don't just impose things on them, talk to people. And if you talk to the workforce, they'd have told you that a figure of 6 from the top down and a clockwise rotation of the right leg is next to impossible. But if you start in the middle of the 6 and you go up and around, you draw the 6 from the middle up and around, it's an entirely complementary movement, not a contradictory movement, and it should be error-free. So half the time when we find things have gone wrong, it's because it was unintentional. The other side of the fence is really interesting because it's a violation. In this case, we know that somebody has done something even though they knew it was unsafe. So they knew they were taking a risk, but they did it anyway. And when we look at this, it's very easy to get into a blame mindset. But there are two things that we need to look at. The first one is, what we've done is we've basically said to our subcontractor, well, we want you to do this and we want you to do this for this cost in this time scale. And the subcontractor will come back and say something like, look, you can have it quick, you can have it cheap, you can have it good quality. Pick any two. You can't have all three. And what we've said to the subcontractor is, that's the price and we'd like all three, please. And we cascade down those problems and you end up where you simply can't do everything. An optimizing a violation is quite interesting because when we look at what's gone wrong, what we find is it's a lot of that back brain stuff. And Alexis introduced the concept of front brain, back brain, which I'll finish with in 5 minutes or so. And what we find with that is the classic but in the wrong place in a sentence. So if we go on a date and we've been dating somebody for a month and they sit us down in a nice wine bar, if we ever get to do that ever again, and they say, Tim, I've really enjoyed dating you this last month, but I don't need them to finish the sentence. I know I'm in trouble. The end of that sentence is, put your coat on, go away. Because we know that everything before a but is so much talk, everything after the but is the meat of it. So how do we convey that in the world of safety? Because what we say is, I want you to do this job safely, but by Friday. And what happens is everybody understands Friday is key. So you get the job by Friday as safely as is viable, and corners are cut and risks will accrue. So when we look at what's going on, often it's these cultural clues and cues that drive it, or it's just difficult to do safely. Then occasionally we come across what looks like an out-and-out individual violation. What on earth were you doing? But before we start judging people for that, we need to cover ABC analysis, which is the last thing I've been asked to cover. ABC analysis says everything we do, every behavior, B, has an antecedent. And antecedents are what we think when we're in a very command and control culture, when we're in a compliance-driven culture. If we tell people what to do and we give them tools and rules, they should do it. But what ABC analysis shows so clearly is it's not the antecedents, which is basically the context before the behavior occurred. It's the consequences, the C, that drive behaviors. And consequences can be three things. They can be soon or delayed, certain or uncertain, and positive or negative. And what we find is if those consequences are soon, certain, and positive, we will be tempted to come up with a workaround, take the risk, and push on. Not everybody gives into to temptation, but a lot of us do. And risk accrues, and the famous Heinrich triangle fills up. And sooner or later, somebody is in the wrong place at the wrong time, and they get hurt. To show this, often at conferences, I'll read a list of really unsafe behaviors like driving too fast, taking drugs, unsafe sex, all that. Say, how many of you are guilty of none of those? And in an audience of 2,000, you might get 2. Well, we all give in to temptation, not always, but often. And we do it outside of work, when we're out playing and socializing. We do it inside of work because we're people. So the rule of thumb is, if the safe way is slow, inconvenient, or uncomfortable, people will be tempted to cut a corner, crack on, take the risk, as they've done 1,000 times before, and assume that this time they'll get away with it again. But the risk accumulates, and sooner or later, somebody's wrong about that. Oscar Wilde said he could resist everything except temptation. We have a comedian in the UK called Stephen Fry, who says, what I do with temptation is I give into it straight away. I find it saves on the messing around. So workplace engagement. What do we do? What do we actually do with all this? Well, 1,001 things. I'm particularly keen on getting the workforce involved in proactive sessions where we say to them, you know what corners are cut out there. You know why. No names. Just tell us what's happening and why, and give us high impact, low cost solutions. But in terms of leadership, and just to address the leadership piece, what are the questions that our frontline leaders have to be in the habit of asking in order to set the right tone? And the first one, of course, as Alexis said, is the curious why question. When things go wrong, 9 times out of 10, there will be a sensible answer to come back at you. So you always assume that. Again, back to our SPY, trust everybody. Why did you do that? What can I learn from that? The second one, of course, is a proactive question, as I've just covered. Is there anything slow, inconvenient, or uncomfortable about what I've asked you to do safely? Because if the answer to that is yes, there will be temptation, people will give into it, there will be risk. The safety differently question, I want you to be safe. You want to be safe. What do you need from me? It's as simple as that. And of course, to go back to the very beginning, all the best work now I think in UK construction, really leading the way, is the mental health piece. So it's asking, how are you? Not what you need for me to be safe, but how are you as a person? What do you need from me to be psychologically healthy? And that's a whole different piece, but I'll jump over that. And just to finish, if I could, just to dovetail with Alexis' piece on thinking fast, thinking slow. This is the only book a psychological book to win a Nobel Prize, Kahneman's Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow. And as Alexis said, what we find is we think our front brain is in control. We think it's all about seeking facts and making decisions based on facts and analysis. 9 times out of 10, we've already made the decision, and we just seek out facts or even make up facts. I reference an American president to justify the decision that we've already taken. And the whole thing is either a virtuous or a vicious circle. And I just wanted to show you some physiology that I think is fascinating. See, basically, if we treat people unfairly, certain parts of the brain light up ready for action. We're hardwired to respond in a certain way. And it's all about conflict, disgust, annoyance, and so on. On the other hand, if we treat people fairly, different parts of our brain light up automatically, ready for action. And these are all to do with planning and cooperation, which brings me to the end of our talk. It's not about the individual, it's about the context with which when the individual is operating. And what we can do is we can set people up to fail, we can set people up to succeed, and we can set people up to thrive and contribute in the ways that both Paul and Alexis have talked about. But we, as organizations, have to take the lead with that. We can't just give an inspirational speaker and say, please don't take any risks. It's all about the context. It's all about setting them up to succeed, setting them up to be safe. Thank you ever so much. That's the end of my talk. Actually on time for once. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tim. And of course, also thank Paul and Alexis and Tim, all three of our guest speakers. So just exactly right on time. So we're moving into the next part, which is a 20-minute panel discussion. So before we start, I also like to introduce one of our additional panelists, who is, of course, Mr. Derek Pang, who is the chairperson of the Committee on Construction Safety of the CIC. So welcome, Derek. Okay, so now the challenge is it's really great to learn about the perspective from our three guest speakers. Some of the material or concepts we have maybe learned a little bit before, but they're put into this very unique kind of perspective, by the three experts. So I guess what we would try to discuss in the panel is how to bring this to the Hong Kong context, to the challenges that we're facing in Hong Kong. Now, I know it's a challenge because I only had a few minutes in the beginning to share some of the things we're doing in Hong Kong. But I hope, of course, with Derek here, we can also, through Derek, share a little bit more as well. So the first question I really want to bring up is there's a lot of, from the three sharing, a lot of it, I think we can hear is from the leadership perspective, what we as leaders should do or can do to have a both the entire different stakeholders, how they work together, as well as especially in Alexis's the ARC model, the leadership behavior, how it's lead by example and how to communicate with the workforce. But I think in Hong Kong's context, a lot of times when we talk about behavioral safety or behavioral approach to safety, there's tend to be a focus at the worker level, about why are workers doing. They're given the clear instructions, but why are they still taking shortcuts, especially when there's a high-risk activity? Now, Tim mentioned about the violations or error, these kinds of concepts as well. So maybe I just start with this area, about in Hong Kong, sometimes in the context of Hong Kong, we observe individual workers. Sometimes they have different behaviors, at different incidents, and there's a very particular way that the current system places responsibility. So, sometimes when the concepts of just culture that was brought up, they don't just apply to the front line. Actually, it was applied maybe even to the contractor or even to the owner, about sharing of responsibility. So maybe I first ask Derek to share a little bit more his experience in Hong Kong around this topic about individuals' behaviors, especially frontline workforce behavior. And maybe we can then open up to the other three speakers to respond. Derek, over to you.
Well, yeah, thanks, Rex. Maybe I'll just use a case that actually happened. Besides being the chairman of the safety committee for CIC, I'm actually also running a construction business in Hong Kong. So we have a case, this actually demonstrates some of the situation we're facing here in Hong Kong is we have a fatality occurred in one of my sites a few years back where we have a tower crane helping the building of a metal frame, a steel frame. It's a non-regular structure, so the center of gravity is not very easy to be calculated. When you lift it, you really need to look at where the center of gravity was. And so we have riggers that were provided by subcontractors, but they were not qualified. And obviously, there is the first part of the mistake. The second part of it is really the controlling of the tower crane has been regulated within my company, where the foreman has the walkie-talkie where it would control the tower crane. It's not allowed for any other person, unauthorized person, to control tower crane. So the tower crane operator knew that, where he would recognize the voice of the foreman, and the foreman knew that he could not pass the walkie-talkie to any other person. It was close to lunchtime where the foreman decided, well, maybe I'll just pass it to the subcontractor and they can deal with it. And lo and behold, the subcontractor, one of the subcontractor workers, who is also the part of the business owner of the subcontractor, had his son actually tying up all the metal frame and lift it up. And the tower crane operator listened to the subcontractor, the worker, and it toppled. And unfortunately, the son was there, and it toppled over it, and he was killed. And obviously, there were a lot of mistakes done by the main contractor. That's obvious. I mean, but at the same time, where these workers were trained, they knew that they were not qualified to do that. And also the foremen who knew that he's not supposed to be walking away from site going to lunch while the other people operating it. And also the tower crane operator knew that was not the right person that he should listen to. Also operated, allow other person to instruct him to operate the tower crane. And that occurred. But the entire situation in Hong Kong, what happened next is we never really go deep into the key responsibilities, who should bear such responsibility. But looking at the company as a whole, the system failure, and then really point out the company need to improve on that. But realistically, I look at it is there are failures in multiple parts in this operation where individual workers should also be responsible, foremen should be responsible, tower crane operators where they were trained and instructed and there were things that they supposed not to do, but they actually did, but they did. And they were let go and they will find a job somewhere else. And that's very common in Hong Kong when we have really serious accident, and we are facing a lot of issues dealing with these kind of matters. So,
yeah, thank you, Derek, for sharing. Maybe we use that as a sort of case to open up to see how maybe the Paul, Tim, or Alexis, you guys want to just jump into this, share from your perspective. Tim, you want to start?
Yeah, sure. I'll go first. You know, obviously, I don't understand that particular case study really well, but the principle is always sound, that we need to get in front of the accident. We don't want to be trying to understand what's happened after it's happened. We want to understand what's likely to happen before it's happened, and that will nearly always be a cultural piece. I give you a very simple case study. I did some work where we'd had a fatality on the railways in the UK, and I was involved in a session where they'd made a film of two guys who just jumped out the way of a train and then were asked to comment on it. They put a camera on, they were very upset, they promised they'd never do it again, and it was all very much about how they behaved. And we showed the film as part of the session to the senior board. And my challenge was, look, you know, so these guys are crying because they're on camera. They've been asked questions about their family and what would have happened if they'd been killed. So they look all very upset. It's all very focused on them. When I asked them to replay the film. And when we replayed the film, I said, look at their body language as they jump out of the way of the train. And their body language was really relaxing. Score them 0 to 10 on how scared they are. We got an average of 1. It was just something they did day in, day out, and they nearly always got away with it. And the clue was in the film. That's how things are here, you know, and talking about what's happened after it's happened and blaming, putting cameras on people is too late. You need to watch the film and see that it's standard and do something about that proactively.
I see Paul also have a comment on this. Paul, over to you.
Thank you. I think from my perspective, that there's two sides of any incident. On the one hand, there's the things we do to stop the incident, the prevention side of things. And that might be protocols, as mentioned, around not sharing the walkie-talkies or the like. And that's what we tend to focus on. But we also need to focus on the other side of it, which is, okay, if the worker makes a mistake or commits a violation, what stops that becoming life-changing or fatal? And that's an area that I'm particularly interested in. I was in Hong Kong last in November, and the whole development of things such as fatal zones, so that we don't allow people into the working area of a crane boom, means that we anticipate as workforce leaders that to err is human. People will make mistakes, and there are all kinds of studies that suggest that the average person on a construction site will make between 5 and 10 mistakes, if you want to call them that, errors of some nature or other every hour. And most of those will be very simple things, but all of us who've worked with a hammer will know that over the course of a day, we are likely to hit our thumb. We've just got to make sure that we've put in place mitigations to stop those becoming very serious. And to my mind, it's looking at that kind of right-hand side of what are we doing to stop something that's, say, an infringement or an error becoming life-changing is a real interesting area of focus.
Thank you for that. I think maybe I bring that to the next area that because even in Paul, in your sharing, you know, of the fearless organization, you know, in that model of the leadership task, there is still at the very end, in terms of responding actions, there's sanction of clear violations. I know it sounds like it's very negative. I know there's a lot of talk about not focus on blame around the presentations from our speakers, but I think in Hong Kong's context, when something terrible happened, of course it's too late. I agree with Tim's point, but oftentimes when things happen, and the response, and Derek shared in one incident, but of course in Hong Kong we do have, unfortunately, close to 20 fatalities every year, and has been kept at that level, in the past decade. And every time when these incidents happen, there are definitely going to be blame around, but it's just maybe the blame, it's not at a certain level, or certain stakeholders have picked up more of the blame. For example, one of the topics that we have today was in Hong Kong, the government is actually introducing legislation to increase the penalty of the relevant occupation safety and health regulations. We're talking about the current initial proposal of 100 times increase, in terms of the penalty, the fee, So, and of course, within the CIC and the industry, there's a lot of discussion about that. But again, this idea, I think is very positive that if we could look ahead and have not to focus on blame side, but of course, in the Hong Kong context, it's also very much a reality as well. So I think it'll be interesting to see what you think would be effective or not. This sort of approach from the government to introduce the penalty and the reality of having blame, how that should be looked at, in a more as positive as possible way. Maybe that's something that maybe Tim, Paul, and Alexis, you guys can share. Maybe Paul, start with you. Thank you. Yep.
Yeah, sure. I'll leave the psychological aspects of blame to those who are better qualified, to Alexis and Tim, who are the psychologists and psychotherapists amongst us. What I can talk about is what happened in the UK in 2016, when we did a very similar exercise, and the extent to which penalties increased was probably approximately tenfold rather than 100-fold. And large organisations started facing fines of multiple millions of UK pounds for serious incidents. The UK law, like the Hong Kong law, is based on the existence of risk rather than necessarily the outcome. Although the law, the jurisprudence has changed, and when someone dies at work, that has to be calculated as an aggravating feature, which effectively means the fine is much more significant. And whilst the penalties for individuals also rose, what we tended to find was that very large organisations started to spend more time training their executives on safety matters. We saw more investment into safety teams, and we saw the professionalisation of safety to some degree, where there was a greater demand for safety professionals who were well trained and qualified, and things such as the NCRQ set of qualifications started to be more prominent alongside the NEBOSH qualifications. And what I would say that the outturn has been that certainly for contracting organisations, where there is a safety incident that maybe takes life, or where there's a large fine, that becomes much more pertinent to tendering exercises. And we've seen a number of contractors in the UK struggle, certainly in public contracts, where they've been involved in large fines and where people have lost their lives. So to some degree, the deterrent effect of the increased sanctions has been helpful in improving safety standards. And that's against a background where the numbers of prosecutions have dropped to a third of what they were 10 years ago. So the numbers have gone down of organisations actually prosecuted, but the penalties have gone up. I'll leave it to my two friends to talk about changing workers' behaviour.
I don't know if Derek want to also pitch into this topic. Okay. So maybe Alexis, would like to share about this idea of the blame and the psychology?
Yeah, I was just thinking, for me, I think the blame is where we automatically go to when we need a reason, and we need to put somebody at the forefront of an incident. And unfortunately, often we're called in to do the kind of crisis intervention when there has been an incident or a death in the workplace after an accident. So we see that impact of the trauma, and also the trauma of investigation, and whether or not the accountability will be put in the right place. And I think that's the thing for me, is that, it's if we're going to hold people accountable, which absolutely that needs to happen, and we want people to come home in the same state as they went into work, then we need to make sure that whatever process is around that makes sure that it's the correct people or level that is accountable. And that we've identified as well prior to that. Obviously, we want to avoid accidents, but prior to that, the patterns of behaviour that go on around these shortcuts, and these are things that will be happening every day, as we all know. It's just that on that particular occasion, there's been an accident and it's gone badly wrong. So understanding people's behaviour and why they are taking those shortcuts, and and the fact that we might only step in when there's actually been an incident. We need to be stepping in well before then in terms of the cultural aspect and understanding blame within the organisation. If blame is, I always consider blame to be a bit like a football. It gets kicked about until somebody gets hold of it and they end up with it. And actually that isn't obviously the way that we want to do it. We want to be able to look at accountability, and it's accountability that we need to be looking at rather than the actual blame of who's done what. Nobody's gone to work, in my experience, with the intention of causing harm to somebody. So yeah, absolutely, having increased penalties and that focus on qualifications and professionalism is really key. But it's also all the kind of work behind the scenes and prior to that point, I think that's really important.
Tim?
Oh, sure. Well, I mean, I agree. And there's a joke here, that if you want everybody to drive safely, just put a spike on the steering wheel and you get everybody's attention. And it's much the same, from a legal perspective, you need to put a spike in the whole place that gets the board's attention. It really is a simple bit of psychology. But as an interesting study, just to jump sideways into the world of well-being that was done here about bike riding schemes. And what they found was that the third reason why people rode bikes more often was if they were somewhere safe and dry to store their bike. The second reason was that there was facilities for them to get warm if they got caught in the rain, or to tidy up if they got caught got sweaty in the sunshine. The sixth reason was understanding that bike riding was good for you. And the first reason was that senior management had a metric that tracked how much bike riding was happening. And I think it was ever thus. We take our lead from the top, and if we can get the top's attention so that the messages they're sending out directly and subliminally with the infamous but, safely but by Friday, needs to be safely and by Friday, because otherwise there will be consequences. I think that's absolutely key. So we come at the problem from a variety of different directions, but primarily by getting the attention of the board to them to understand that good safety is good business, and to have world-class safety, you have to have quality dialogue, you have to have empowerment, you have to have analytical thinking, you have to have coaching, all the good stuff that we've talked about, and that will deliver you spin-off benefits. Less absenteeism, less presenteeism, more discretionary effort, all those things, fewer turnover of your key staff, because it's your best staff that are most mobile. All of those things are derived if you get the culture right, and that starts from the top.
Rex, may I ask a question? First of all, I want to say that, Alexa, I really agree about the accountability, and that's the issue that we are facing in Hong Kong. There are, increasing the fine, increasing penalties is fine, but really, does it really hold the right person, right organization accountable for the actions? It's something that CIC, we're striving to do that more now. The other area that I'm looking at is really clients' participation in safety. In Hong Kong, we see a trend that the government contracts actually perform better in safety than the private contracts. And there is an active role in government contracts that they actually, maybe they have KPIs internally, but they do actually actively participate in the project safety, either promotion training and all these kind of stuff. But there is really no regulations in Hong Kong requiring clients to do anything. So ultimately, the top tier guy that is responsible for safety is the main contractor in Hong Kong. I wonder, in your region, in your other areas, what do you guys think about this? And are there examples that actually clients actually can help on safety? Thanks.
Yeah, I think Paul would have something to share on this topic. Go ahead, Paul.
I do. I think one of the things that's interesting is what is it that's been measured that says government contracts are better? Because what we see looking over towards Hong Kong, is sometimes the questions you ask and the metrics you record are all quite subjective. So if you decide you will record near misses, for instance, in a private contract, which I've seen in a number of private contracts, and you get a lot of near misses, that may start to appear that you're running an unsafe operation. And it may be that if you're scared to report near misses to a government contract, then the statistics suggest you aren't having any near misses, whereas in fact they may just be unreported. And that comes back to Tim's comments about zero harm, that if you have a zero harm mission and you have an accident in the third week of January, then you failed the rest of the year. And so I'm not a great believer that they are truly safer contracts. I think it may be that they are reported and analysed in a way which suggests they are. Separately, I think that the issue of how to improve those contract performances is look at some of the leading metrics. And the leading metrics that we suggest are considered are, do we have risk assessments for every significant activity? Do we have the evidence assurance? And something that I've seen Tim work on for the last decade has been the quality of the conversation between somebody who's doing a workplace tour and someone who's an operator. And those are the kinds of exercises that certainly in the UK, we see as being particularly helpful.
Yeah, I think this part of the session is coming to a close, but we still have the last 15 minutes, which is the opening up to the audience. And I understand Tony would be already collecting some of the questions and will help us to moderate this Q&A session. So I pass it over to Tony. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Res and Derek. We have identified 2 questions from the audience. And the first one, I think, is quite similar to what we have just discussed. The first question is they're asking, do you think a clear role and responsibility could help to change the behavior? And he means someone actually taking the consequence for what he did. So what do you think? Do you think is a clear role and responsibility actually did helping changing the behavior?
Maybe I can just look at it from a legal basis in the UK, again, before I refer to my friends. In the UK, we have a law that says that people have to take reasonable care of their health and safety whilst at work and that of other people. I think it's very difficult to work out what's reasonable unless the individual knows what's expected of them. And certainly with my clients, who are mostly global multinational companies, there is a surprising lack of clarity as to what's expected of people, particularly if they've been working for the same company for maybe 10 or more years, and they've been promoted up through the ranks, where they may not actually be clear as to what is expected of them, what training they need, and how they need to monitor people around them. And without that clarity, it's easy for there to be gaps. And it's also easy that when things go wrong, for them to be criticised, because the reference point might be what other people with the same job title are doing. Mm-hmm. And so I agree with the delegate's question that clarity as to exactly what is expected of you or I is mm-hmm. vital in being able to work out what our responsibilities are.
Okay, thank you. So I think we answered that question with that audience. The second one is, I think it's to Tim, is the people asking consequent to can lead to a behavioral change. And before we talk about blame is not the answer. So the people asking what's the answer?
Okay, what is the answer if blame isn't? I just want to pick up on Paul's comment if I can. You know, it's I touched on it on my talk. I end up in courts often as a witness on these things. You know, you can be really crystal clear what roles, responsibilities, etc. are, but if you set somebody up and then just before they go off to work, you essentially say safely, but by Friday, you are going 9 times out of 10 to get that done by Friday as safely as is viable. And then we'll all end up in court, and the person who's in trouble will be saying, yes, he said safely, but, and it all gets very messy and it all gets very blamey, and it's about who's got the best lawyer. And that's what we want to avoid. We absolutely want to avoid that. So the second question is, if blame isn't the answer, what is? Objective analysis and empowering of the workforce. They're those two things. The more we can understand why people do what they do, because they will make mistakes, and I'm back with Tony McCoy falling off his horse. The more we understand that people will make mistakes and they will respond to subconscious cues to try and give you what they think you really want, the better we are. And the more we can empower people to get actively involved, to get switched on, the better. So it's all about empowerment and analysis for me.
Okay.
Alex. Yeah, I would agree completely with Tim there. I think it's taking time to do the research and to understand what's going on and why it's happening. There aren't quick fixes to, removing this kind of cultural aspect around blame. It's taking time to actually understand what these behaviours mean and what the patterns of behaviours are and what impact that's having. And each organisation, especially when the subcontractors and they've each got their own cultural aspects and organisational culture as well. So that brings another layer of complexity. But absolutely looking and analysing what is happening and then being able to empower the workforce and going back to that why are they doing what they're doing and giving them that value behind it as well as I think the praise as well when jobs have been done well and acknowledgement and all of that. It's the balance of the two. If it's going purely towards blame, there's no antidote to that. That's where you'll head and that's where it will go. It's getting the balance between accountability and also that kind of praise and recognition of the workforce as well.
Right. Okay, thank you, Analysis. How about Paul? You have any supplement? Or?
No, I think that those comments are ones that I would echo. And that the key is this idea of being able to learn from events rather than penalising them. And for me, the openness of that culture is the key between an organisation which succeeds and one which doesn't.
Okay. So I think it's the last one, and the people talking about are we too focusing on the negative, or maybe focusing on the positive side will be a way for the future.
I'll take that first because I can be really quick. Yes.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for answer. Very straightforward.
Maybe I just circle back to Derek's earlier point because the reason why Derek brought up the stakeholders' role, in terms of blame, but also in the positive influence they can have. Again, going back to your leadership approach. Role model, in communication, it's not just individual to individual, but also in the construction industry and the entire supply chain, all the way to the front line. But on the very, very top, of course, is the client. And I think what Derek was sharing earlier is that in Hong Kong, we have a lot of public work, which, of course, the client's the government, but also we have a lot of private work, which is the private sector clients. And I think the idea is that there's currently not a lot of ways to encourage or penalize, certain stakeholder at the top who may have the most potential to influence changing behavior and across the entire supply chain. So I guess in Hong Kong, if we're facing such a challenge, how can we apply in the absence of legislation or in the absence of the correct accountability mechanism? How can we positively, engage people aside from preaching to them, that these are things that you should care. What would be the experience in the UK, or are there different legislation there? That's why the government or the stakeholders, the clients there are much more willing, to take the leadership role.
Rex, thank you for that. I think what I would say is that that's where the contract comes in. And one of the things that I've noted in relation to that kind of contract in Asia is that sometimes the safety parts of it are accepted but not monitored. Whereas I think in the UK, there tends to be much more formal arrangements made between a contractor and a client in terms of what's expected, not necessarily in terms of outcomes, But for instance, the number of inspections which the client will carry out, the number of inspections which the contractor will carry out, the amount of data which will be created. And in the UK, obviously, we have the CDM regulations, which set out in full how a health and safety file must be prepared and how the regulator themselves are notified for large-scale construction projects. And whilst there's an iteration of that in Hong Kong, that kind of formalisation of the planning stage tends to be the document that gets looked at when there is a dispute, but it's also used by the client when they're dealing with matters of price and quality to go, this is what you committed to, and we aren't seeing evidence of that. And of course, that has to be priced into the contract for it to be a level playing field.
Maybe I just add one point. I think maybe Derek can share it as well. Like in Tim's example about the but, right? But Friday, who is going to say this but Friday? Of course, it's the client, who is going to say but Friday, So that could be put the other way, do all this for me by Friday, but also do it safely, but do it safely, it could go the other way. So I guess in the experience of Hong Kong, again, I think what Paul, you share from the UK experience is relevant for us, and CDM, in terms of considering design for safety, in the planning. And I know that there are many good clients in Hong Kong. They're not in the public government, but they also already have adopted and tried out these different approaches. So there's also good examples. But again, I think it's a large industry in Hong Kong, so we're facing a lot of challenges across.
And Rex, I would like to clarify the metrics which asked earlier. I mean, the fatalities in government-managed contract, ministers' contract, is a lot less than the private sector's contracts, and we're looking at fatalities alone. So, and roughly, I mean, Hong Kong investment in construction is roughly half and half. You can look at the by government and by private. So that's the metrics I'm looking at. Thanks.
Yeah, if I could jump in, on the butt thing, it's not even getting the butt in the right place. And what we've all three of us said this morning really clearly is, the more often we say, I want this doing safely by Friday and safely, now let's talk about any problems with that. That's what we're saying. And it sounds to me like you might get that dialogue more often with government contracts than with private contracts.
Okay, so I think we got no more questions. So thank you so much for participating in this webinar. Thank you, Paul, Tim, and Nessa. So we will going to finish this webinar, and also I want to remind the audience, if you want to apply the CPD certificate, we will send you an individual email for you, and we will have some information required for you to complete to get your CPD. So thank you for showing up, and have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you again. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Alexis. Thank you, Derek.
Thank you.
Thank you, all our audience. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.